morning, everyone, and Happy New Year to you all. Welcome to our webinar today about sustaining improvements, a very good topic for the first part of the year. And I'd like to just start off first by doing a quick sound check like we normally do, just to make sure that I'm coming in loud and clear. If those of you who've been on before and know how to raise your hand, if you could please raise your hand and let me know you can hear me loud and clear, that would be great. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. I'm going to put everyone's hands down now. Okay, so today what we're going to do is talk a little bit about some of the things in planning, executing, and doing follow-up in improvements that will make your improvements far more likely to sustain and far less likely to slip back. As far as the technology for this webinar today, if you're using your telephone to listen, please make sure you enter in your audio pin, which you'll see circled on the right side of the screen here. And then if you're using speakers, if you want to ask any questions verbally, of course you would need to have a microphone available. And we'll be doing the Q&A later in the broadcast. If you want to ask a question, there are those two ways. One, you can raise your hand and I'll unmute you and we can talk verbally and everyone would be able to hear you. Right now everyone is muted. Or you can type a question into the question log. You can type them in throughout the session, but I'm going to wait until 11 o'clock to take questions. So the first hour will be content and the last half hour will be a Q&A. If you haven't already gotten the materials, the link is available here on this screen. If you want to download a copy for yourself, they're PDFs, and there's two options. One is one slide per page, and one is a handout with 2 slides per page. So today what we're going to cover are some practical how-tos for implementing what I consider to be 4 essential elements for lasting change. There are certainly well more than 4. In fact, one could argue that there are hundreds. But these are the 4 that I find missing more of the time than some of the other ones. So I'm going to focus on those. And then we're going to talk a lot about the whole role of a process owner and using key performance indicators to what I call keeping the heat on. Because all too often after process is improved, people just think it's going to self-sustain and it's just going to, everything's going to be great. But in fact, you have to keep heat on a process in order for it to stay stabilized. We'll talk a little bit about that process owner role. Who are these people? What do they do? And then also we're going to talk a bit about helping leadership understand that this takes an investment, that process improvement doesn't just happen and magic dust doesn't exist. So we'll help you learn how to talk with leadership about that. And then finally we'll talk about how the process for making improvement is what does the best job at creating culture in your organization, not the other way around. So without further ado, let's dive in. Oh, I forgot. For some of you are new, actually quite a few of you are new today on the webinar, so I wanted to just quickly give a little background about who I am and what my perspective is. I started out my career after college as a scientist, but then I quickly fell in love with business and operations design specifically, and so I started working in quality and operations design in the mid-'80s, and I started my consulting firm in '93 in Santa Monica and then moved it to San Diego in 2000. I specialize in facilitating and providing support for lean transformations in non-manufacturing settings, so office service, knowledge work. My client base is everything from healthcare to financial services, energy, law enforcement, government, distribution, and within manufacturing, the office side of manufacturing. Mike Osterling and I co-wrote a book called The Kaizen Event Planner, and we co-developed an Excel tool that's a automated version of our a mapping approach we developed called metrics-based process mapping. And when I'm not with clients, I'm teaching at the University of California, San Diego in our Lean Enterprise program. So, first thing I'd like to say is that I believe more and more, as I've been in this industry for now over 20 years, that when it comes to making improvement, 80% of it is psychology. And only 20% of it is proficiency with tools like value stream mapping and Kaizen events and pull systems. And so if you're a professional improvement person on the line, an improvement professional, you probably are getting better and better with the tools and perhaps need a little more development in psychology. That's what I notice when I'm working with facilitators most of the time. So I think that, if you want to put some New Year's goals in place, one of them would be to become more proficient with understanding what motivates people, why people resist change, and what to do about it, as well as why it is that the different ways that you go about making improvement either help it stick or not. So there are things that we're doing all along the way that will make our jobs much more easy or more difficult and make us more successful or more prone to failure. Now, as far as the 4 essential elements, there are 3 elements, but one of them has 2 different components. So the first one's strategy, the strategy we use to make improvement, and then there's the people we involve in the process, and then there's the process itself. And I've broken the process itself down into the design and implementation phase for actually executing the change, and then what you do after that change is in place, and this is the tricky one, the post-implementation phase. And we're going to take them one by one. When you think about the PDCA cycle, which most of you are very familiar with, one of the things we sometimes don't remember is that PDCA cycle applies to making improvement from a very holistic high level, as well as helping use it for within the improvement process itself to design and implement change. So if you approach an improvement that needs to be made using that PDCA structure, you'll be much more successful than if you don't. So what we're going to do is take each phase of this PDCA and kind of marry up with this the 4 elements that I find missing or maybe not as robust as they could be as people are approaching improvement. We'll take that one by one throughout the process today, and so we're going to start, of course, with planning. So the planning stage of an improvement, and this could be a project, it could be a Kaizen event, it could be a very quick little improvement, but one thing that we're not really talking about on today's webinar are the tiny little daily Kaizens where there's tiny, tiny little process tweaks being done, ideally every day, all day long. We're talking about improvements that are the most likely to slip are the ones that are the bigger ones that we're making. So 3 things you need to do is create a charter, and that charter has a whole lot of process and psychology behind it. Scope the effort to make sure that it's doable, and then form the team that's going to help you with that effort. So we'll take that into detail right now. Each one of the stages of PDCA, I've created a sustainability checklist. These are not complete checklists, but again, they're the areas that I think seem to be more tricky when you're planning improvement. And I'm not also going to go through each one of these. I'm just going to pick a couple on each one of these checklists. So on our plan checklist, the first one we're going to talk about is this whole idea of alignment and strategy and making sure that whatever you're doing improvement-wise, and again, we're talking big improvement projects, are aligned with some sort of organizational strategy and the business goals for the year. And then we'll go through a couple more of these as we continue on the webinar. So let's talk about strategy. What do we mean by that? Well, what I see happening much of the time is that there is a corporate strategy or organizational strategy that may or may not be very clear, and it may or may not be well communicated, but there is usually some sort of strategy, and oftentimes the improvement efforts that we choose to get involved with aren't necessarily aligned with that strategy. So ideally, you work in an organization where there's an extremely clear leadership strategy set up, months before the fiscal year starts, and then that trickles down to a division or a department level, and that strategy is put together, and then that trickles down to, a work group level, and that strategy is put together so that there's alignment across the whole organization. If you're a dedicated improvement resource and you've got a central office and you don't know what all of those different strategies are, you need to make it your business to learn. You need to ask the questions and find out what it is and help guide the organization away from those areas that are going to occupy a lot of resources but aren't necessarily going to achieve the organizational goals. We all know that all of us in this business, that there are 9 million things that we could do to make improvement in an organization. The key is prioritization, and then within that, focus. And so if you don't prioritize according to the organization's overarching strategy, then you're not likely going to be making the best use of your resources. So not only will you not necessarily, use your resources as wisely as you could, it's extremely difficult to create a good sense of urgency from the front lines all the way up when it's not tied to this big overarching goal that the organization has set forth. When you've got the CEO, COO, CFO, CIO, and all the executive vice presidents and all the directors lined up to accomplish a certain set of goals and objectives for the year, and then you have something that's clearly tied to that, it will naturally create a sense of urgency that it won't necessarily otherwise. So our job as improvement professionals is to educate the front lines on what those goals are and educate them on why the improvement that we're tackling is directly linked to it and why this matters and why we do need to have a sense of urgency. So that's one way to instill a sense of urgency. A couple of you asked that question when you registered. That's one way to get it. The other risk, if you don't have a clear strategy for improvement, is sub-optimization. What I mean by that is that you can take on an improvement project and actually get brilliant results, but it may not do anything to move the organization forward in achieving its annual goals. And so while it's a great effort and everyone's excited about it and it may reduce some pain in one part of the organization, what we're trying to do in this holistic approach that Lean is so well known for is to reduce pain organizationally as a whole, and that means that you've got to align with strategy that's being set from the top. The other risk is, the last thing we need is to introduce more chaos in our chaotic systems that we already live in and day out. And so if you don't have that alignment, you're much more likely to introduce more chaos and confusion into the system. And then finally, one of the things that it's very difficult to measure our success if we don't have some sort of a clear strategy on what we were supposed to accomplish. So just like setting goals personally for the new year, which many of you probably read in my newsletter yesterday, at the end of the year, if you've had measurable objectives that you've set forth, it's easy to say, yeah, I accomplished that, yeah, I surpassed that, or whoops, didn't get quite there. I'll move it over to the next year, or maybe it no longer is relevant. So you need to be able to measure success. And then lastly, and this is a real important one in today's economic environment, I'm working with a client that literally laid off its entire Six Sigma Black Belt team with exception of one person. And, why does that happen? Why, when the going gets tough, do people cut improvement professionals? Well, because they're viewed as non-essential and non-value-adding in some cases. And so it's our job to become value-adding and completely indispensable in organizations so that when the market gets tough, we aren't necessarily the first on the chopping block. And one of the things that's important is if you're not proving that you're creating results that are directly lined up with that organizational strategy, there's a great opportunity there. And so that's another thing to think about is, just kind of survival and keeping your organization and your department high on the organization's priority list because you're producing such incredible results that are directly tied to them reaching their goals at the top. Now, there are many ways to go about setting up a strategy. The one that's getting a lot of press these days is Hoshin Conry, which is the Toyota method for annual planning, and this happens to be what's called an X matrix. It's too much to go into in this one webinar, but the point is that you need to have some sort of a strategy that takes and look at all the different operational improvements you might be making and how does that align to the organizational goals that are being established for your fiscal year. So again, this is only one of many ways you can set up a very clear strategic plan. Just doing a strategic plan is the good first step. Now let's talk about charters. I've been in the improvement world now for over 20 years, and it still shocks me how many times I go into an organization and ask them what kind of a charter they use for planning and communicating improvement that's going to happen, and hear the answer either A, we don't use one, or B, here it is, and I look at it and I'm thinking, well, it's no wonder things aren't sustaining because the charter doesn't have nearly enough information and it doesn't set the psychological tone for improvement nearly to the degree that it should. So we're going to go into one or a couple different versions of charters that you could take a look at. I recommend everyone develops their own charter that works for their organization. Mike and I do have one on a CD in our Kaizen event planner that's one that is kind of a generic charter we created to start with, but I do think that it's helpful for an organization to customize and create a charter just for their own good and use. So I'm going to show you two of these. This is the first one that is adapted from the Kaizen event charter, but this could be for regular old projects or any kind of improvement. And the thing I want to point out here is that on the left side of the charter, you have pretty much this whole area on the left side is about scoping. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? What specifically are we excluding? What specifically are we including? That type of thing. And then the middle section's the people part of it. Who's going to be overseeing this and involved with it intimately? And then this little upper right-hand corner is more the logistics of dates and meetings, interim briefings, and that type of thing. The thing I want to point out here is that this improvement driver section becomes key in setting the psychological tone and establishing a sense of urgency. All too often, people, especially on the front lines, really don't understand why something's a big deal. And it's our job to teach them on what's a big deal about this performance or this process, and why is it not performing the way it needs to, and what does it need to do? How should it be performing if it's not performing the way it needs to be? So you've got to use data. It's one thing to use words and describe something. It's a whole nother psychological shaping tool to use data, because data, unless you've gathered it incorrectly, data doesn't lie. And so data is your friend. And data will do so much to shape people's thinking about how they approach improvement and how they embrace improvement. So the next thing that you need to think about is, if you want to create a custom charter for your organization, there's this upper right-hand corner here. We've converted it to being a key milestone portion of the charter, where you can put dates for what phase of PDCA are we going to be in and when. So, at what point are we going to be complete with current state analysis, and then when do we think we'll be done with root cause analysis? And you may or may not get it exactly right, but at least if you set a target there, you'll be much more assured that you're going to be moving along the improvement process rather than just lagging and lingering on. It gives people, a good target for how you should be progressing in the improvement process. Now, the next thing I want to talk about, that's all I'm going to talk about with strategy. There's a little more, but those are the big things. So the next thing is going to be the people. And this is another one where I'm just continually surprised that the right people haven't been involved in process improvement any more than they have in some settings. So let's see how you do when it comes to this people piece of it. So I'm going to skip all the way down here now to in our sustainability checklist, or the things that we need to do in the planning phase of PDCA in order to assure sustainability at the end, is getting an engaged executive sponsor. Now, again, for very small improvements, you're not going to have an executive sponsor. But for something fairly meaty, including a Kaizen event, a 2 to 5 day sequestered team focused on a very specific problem to be solved, you need some sort of an engaged executive sponsor in order to, A, show the organization and show the team how important this is, and B, have someone available to help remove obstacles. You want to be able to move through the improvement process as quickly as possible, and especially in non-manufacturing arenas where you've got all kinds of policy wrapped into procedure and policies that need to be challenged. You really need an executive sponsor that's going to be helpful to manipulate and maneuver within the organization to get agreement on key issues. So the role of that executive sponsor is something that you may actually have to teach or coach them on. They may not necessarily understand what their role is or what you want them to do, and it's very nice, and it's surprising actually how many times a leader will say to me, tell me what to do. And, that's beautiful, because it gives you the opportunity to shape and teach them on what their role is in this whole thing. So the first thing that they absolutely have to show up. Now, they could be on the phone if you've got a remote, situation on your hands, but they need to show up for kickoffs and briefings, because that sets the tone from the beginning that this is important. So fast forward to now the improvements in place, and you're wondering why it's not sustaining. If you haven't had any kind of, leadership face involved in that improvement, then no one's going to think it matters, because if it's not important to leadership, then why should they care? So that's something to think about as far as how you engage your leaders in making a physical presence, or at least a voice presence, with your teams that you might be working with. And then the other thing is that, a good leader will be a good coach, and they will be asking questions along the way to assure that the improvement's on track. So they'll be asking questions about deadlines and asking questions about whether the right people have been involved, and they'll help whoever is leading the project or the improvement, stay true to the organization's person's goals and those types of things by being engaged. And the other thing that I'd like to suggest is please don't wait for the executive sponsor to ask you for an update. If you're leading an improvement project, you need to take charge and schedule meetings and get in front of that leader consistently. Now, it may not be frequently, but pretty consistently, depending on the kind of improvement it is. You need to definitely engage that and help. You're helping shape behavior. You know, we're managing up in this example, but you're helping shape behavior for the future by saying, hey, executive sponsor, you know, I would like you to do this, this, and this, you know, would that work? And, you know, I'd like to meet with you, you know, just to keep us on track. Would that work? And those types of things to keep them engaged. The next thing that we're going to move now, we're into page 2 of our sustainability checklist. I'm sorry, not page 2. On the last item on our sustainability checklist is the cross-functional project team. This has to be a project team that is heavily weighted with people who actually do the work and or use the process. So I'm going to give you an example of something that I'm now working with my 3rd project in very close months that has a heavy IT component. Actually, most of my projects have a heavy IT component, information technology. And one of the things that I see happening over and over and over is that the IT departments typically don't just immediately say, yeah, let's get all the users on our, you know, get some of the users on our team. They tend to want to function a bit in a vacuum, which Lean is here to help shift. So it's very important that even though the people that are, you know, employees of an organization aren't necessarily doing an IT process, they are the users or the benefactors of the process, and so they need to be heavily engaged with any kind of improvement that's IT specific and not just leadership. There needs to be front lines that are going to use whatever is being designed, frontline representation on the teams. So let's talk about some common weaknesses in teams besides those types of issues. I see all too often teams what I call being thrown together, and it's sometimes because of time, it's sometimes because people are feeling panicked, but you know, PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act, we're in the P stage. And as those of you who've worked with me for a while know, you know, one of my mantras is the P needs to be at least 50% of the total time it takes to make the improvement. You need to have a very, very solid plan going in, or there's no way you can be successful and sustain the improvement. So part of that taking time is to sit down and be very thoughtful in putting a very strong team together. So it needs to be a strategic activity on who's going to be involved in an improvement. 2 large teams. 10 people is about as many cooks in the kitchen as any group can tolerate. You get more than that and it slows down the process. It can create all kinds of team dynamics issues. So 12 on rare occasions, but try really hard to get your teams, your core teams this is, to be only 10 people. If you can only get 1 functional representative on that team in order to keep it at 10, then that's what you do, and you come up with alternative means to engage other groups within a functional area in the process, which I will talk about in just a minute. These teams need to have heavy frontline representation. Oftentimes it's all supervisors, managers, directors, vice presidents, and not enough of the people that actually do the work. And the other thing is missing the suppliers and customers. I mentioned the customer piece given that IT example, but the other thing is missing suppliers that are supplying information or data or material in some cases into the process. They need to be on the team as well. We can't just assume that whatever we do, they're going to necessarily be able to accommodate. Missing functions is tricky, and it is a hard one to be perfect on. I think that at least 80% of the improvements that I'm involved with, as thoughtful as we are up front and as much as we understand about the process up front, we still always seem to miss somebody. And it's just because once you get into a very complicated environment that most non-manufacturing settings are, and I'm talking about the office side of manufacturing as well, there's just a lot of cooks in the kitchen, and so it's difficult to remember everyone. I just had a situation with a prospective client. We're putting a team together, and everyone was dead set on the team. Everyone was sure we had everyone. And then boom, I start doing some analysis. We're missing a pharmacy representative. And, the initial reaction when I said we need a pharmacy representative wasn't, oh, yeah, you're right. It was like, well, why? Why do we need pharmacy? And so you have to really think through these things, and it's tough to get it right, but definitely at least spend the time that'll make it more likely that you don't forget 2 or 3 functions and maybe you only forget 1. The other thing is that oftentimes I find that because there are so many Six Sigma black belts and green belts out there now, and so many industrial engineers in the corporate sector now, not just in manufacturing, a lot of times folks that have been through that kind of training assume that they're going to be the doers, that they're going to do the improvement. They're going to do all the analysis. They're going to decide what's going to be done. They're going to implement it. It's their job to do. Lean would argue vehemently with that. Lean would argue that no one in a improvement leadership capacity should be doing. You should be facilitating and teaching and managing and coaching and leading. It's not a doer role. And that's sometimes very difficult for people to understand and to gain skills in if you're not used to being a doer. Because, if you're used to being a doer. So it's a very different skill set to teach, lead, coach, manage, different skills than being technically competent in the mechanics of making improvement. You need both to be a decent facilitator, but you definitely, I see more developmental opportunities on that leadership, teacher, coach, mentor kind of role than in the technical. So the team that's put together is not merely advisory. They're the ones that are supposed to be heavily engaged in gathering the data and working with the facilitator, analyzing it, and the facilitators teaching them how to see what they see, smell what they smell, do what they do, that type of thing, in order to leverage improvement across the whole organization. So that's the couple of things I wanted to mention about the people that are involved in the process. And now we're ready to move into the meaty part, the improvement process itself. So let's talk first about what you can do in the design and implementation phase that make it that much more likely that an improvement will sustain itself. So we're now moving into the do stage of our plan, do, check, act. And in this stage, as you are well aware, there's a lot of discovery going on. And then once you get a very clear understanding about the current state, the whole design and testing and implementing the improvement, and then creating a sustainability plan, and then training staff so that they know how to do the new process. So let's take a look at a checklist that you could use in this stage to see whether or not you're likely going to be able to sustain that improvement long after it's been implemented. So I'm not going to go through all of these first couple. I will touch on them a little bit, and if you have any questions about those, certainly you can ask them in the Q&A phase. But I want to quickly move into this whole idea of a key performance indicator. Many of you asked questions about that when you registered, and it's something that I think is we're still in the infant stages in non-manufacturing of understanding what a KPI or a key performance indicator is and what you do with them. So let's take a good look at this. If you look at overall organizational performance, one of the things that is important is that we consider all the different aspects of performance when we're looking at a process. So any organization, any division, department, any work group, any process needs to be high quality, delivered at as low cost as possible in order to keep price down for the customers, delivered as quickly as possible in a very safe manner for both the employees doing the work and the recipients, for example, in healthcare patients, and morale of the workforce. Quality, cost, delivery, safety, morale, QCD, SM. They've been around for a while. I think it actually was TQM, part of the TQM model that said these were the 5 areas, but it still holds true today. And today we know that there are some of them that you just can't live without in an organization, and some that are the key differentiators between competitors. So when you're looking at a process, you don't need to have KPIs on all 5 of these. The rule of thumb is 2 to 5 KPIs. So no more than 5. You need to stay focused, and so that you can get good results and get analysis done and execute improvement based on that analysis, but it could be, you know, 2 of these, 3 of these. It could be 3 KPIs that are all in one bucket, all in quality, for example, if that's the problem that you're there to solve. But you want to be holistic in thinking through the options for how you measure performance of a process. So, you know, in a group like this with all different industries on the line and many different processes, there's no way for me to give you specific advice, but if you have any specific questions at the end, I'd be happy to give you some ideas on a KPI for a specific issue. But think about it this way. What problem were you trying to solve? What problem did you solve with whatever solutions and countermeasures you put in place? And what's key to measure to make sure that you don't have that problem recur? So you're thinking about, you know, how do you lock this in? What problem did you solve and want to prevent from recurring? That will give you an indication on what your KPIs should be, or what one of them should be. What's the best measure of success? Once you're done with an improvement process, how do you tell whether you succeeded? That should be a KPI. Now, some other considerations are how frequently should the process be measured, and that very much depends on what the nature of the problem was. And then when you get improvement in place, how robust is the process and how stabilized is it? If it's still running out of control, then you're going to need to measure far more frequently than if you've got a process that's performing pretty consistently pretty quickly, and then everything in between. So you have to measure the process enough and frequently enough that you can see it going off track. The other thing that matters is volume. How much volume do you have in this process? If you have a low volume process, then of course you're going to be measuring a little less frequently than if you've got a high volume process. Who's going to analyze the data? Well, that's going to be the process owner. We'll talk about that in just a bit. And one of the things to think about with these KPIs is if you can get leading indicators in there, meaning that you can get a measurement taken and it's early enough in the process that you can change the outcome of the process, that would be a great KPI to put in there. So it's called a leading indicator, where it's a leading determinant of what the outcome is going to be. So we can still change the outcome, versus a lagging indicator, which is the process is done, it's already occurred, you know, now we're looking at it just more from a, how can we do this better the next time? So it's how can we do it better now versus how can we do it better the next time, leading versus lagging. The other thing is that KPIs are typically pretty heavily operational in nature. So it's, you know, speed, quality, those kinds of things. But you could also include financial measures, customer-focused measures, and staff-focused measures. So a lot of the teams I've been working with over the last couple of years, we've been putting in staff-focused measures to show the reduction in frustration and, in some cases, days off, you know, sick days, workers' comp claims. I mean, you name it. But we're looking at how is improvement affecting our staff in a positive way. And then the other thing that's an important consideration is that these KPIs should be posted physically, not just in a computer, and teams should discuss the results. So one of the things that we can learn from manufacturing is these, you know, quick 5 to 15-minute stand-up meetings huddled around a physical display board, talking about the results and brainstorming on solutions to make the process work even better. Those kinds of things start driving continuous improvement into the organization. Also, it is extremely difficult to let a process slip if you know you're being measured. People behave based on how they're being measured. It's just Psych 101. And so if you have KPIs out there that are, you know, being used and taken seriously and are constantly being talked about, then it's much less likely that someone's going to say, I'm going to go back to the old way. This doesn't matter. So now this isn't a metrics webinar, so I don't have a whole lot of material I'm going to be talking about as far as the KPIs. That's a whole different webinar. But something to think about is that when you have, so up here we have up to 5 different KPIs you would define. It's important to know, well, what should it be? What is it? Why is there a gap between what should it be and why and what it is? What are we going to do about it? And then once we do it, what's our new result? So again, it doesn't have to be this table exactly, but those are the kinds of thought processes that need to be in place as you're managing KPIs. So, and another thing, I'm a big believer in color coding so that people can at a glance see, what's going on. So more of a dashboard environment. So in this case, we have a turnaround, like a lead time metric that the target was 4 hours. It was actually 6.2, so red because it's not good. And it was because there were errors on incoming orders, and so then there was a modification of the order form to reduce the errors, made it easier to complete, and then that resulted in a 3.8-hour result, which was ahead of the target, which is good, so green. And then same thing as far as a target result of output errors from this particular department. They were targeting them to be 2%. They were actually only 1%, so good to go. Oh, I'm sorry, that should have been green. I didn't color code that. That should have been a green number 1 there. And then, of course, we don't need to do any root cause because we're ahead of plan. So another thing that's important to do is to make sure your KPIs are not just numbers. You want to have them be as visual as possible, and there are all kinds of ways to do this visually. There are pie charts, there are line charts, and this is a bar graph that compares what the target numbers should be, what their actual numbers are, and then what an industry benchmark is. And so in this case, you can see that when they started on an A3, that's the problem-solving tool that this team used. When we started on that, we were, well below what the target was and well below what the benchmark in the industry was. And then in only 1 quarter, they were able to get the actual to not only exceed the target, but also exceed the benchmark. So now the key is how do we keep that moving up or at least sustaining it? And the jury's out on that, and we're going to find out in 1 week what the answer is on that. Now, one of the things that we can also learn from manufacturing in the white-collar world are the value of visual displays. I would argue that this one is a little overkill, in fact, a lot overkill if you're just beginning. This happens to be a photo from a very, very mature lean operation, so they're very used to visuals and managing using KPIs. So it's a much more extensive visual display than what you would normally see. But take a look at this. Notice how they have a safety board, a quality board, actually a very big quality board, a productivity board, a cost board, and then a people development board. So a very holistic view of how they're improving and what they need to do, of course, to continue improving. If you'd like to see a close-up of one of those, this happens to be a close-up of the quality corner. I see that there's a little bit of a lag here. There you go. So the quality corner it has a lot of different segments to it. And so you can create whatever makes sense for your organization. And I would recommend you start out fairly simple to begin with and not have this kind of an overkill situation. We don't want to go from famine to feast. Somewhere in the middle might be a good place to start. Now, we are in the do still section of our checklist. Let's talk about this little thing I'm calling process owners. This is something that intrigues me, that we are this far into improvement methodologies. I mean, we've been at it since the 50s with TQM and CQI and reengineering and lean and Six Sigma and agile and you name it. There's all these different philosophies, and yet we still don't seem to be very effective at sustaining improvement. Why is that? It's because outside of manufacturing, no one practically is doing what needs to be done. No one. I mean, I'm not seeing it. After years and years of preaching this, I'm still not seeing it, which just goes to show that we have to do more. We have somehow, I'm not succeeding as an educator. So let's talk about why you need process ownership. Processes will never self-manage. We don't self-manage ourselves. Our closets don't self-manage themselves. If we clean out our closet and get it all nice and tidy, does it stay that way forever? No, it doesn't. Unless you are a superstar beyond anything I've ever met in my life, it doesn't. And it doesn't because A, we're not getting rewarded or disciplined based on it. B, no one has a standard work procedure that's posted on the inside of our closet. C, no leader is saying, hey, what's up with that closet? Go on and on. Though that's a perfect example of how processes just simply don't self-manage. You have to have focus and discipline. The other thing is that a lot of organizations are so afraid to name someone a process owner because they misconstrue the word owner. Owner doesn't mean it's mine, no one can touch it. Owner means I am watching this, I'm keeping the heat on, I am keeping my eye on the ball, I'm going to own how this thing is performing, and I'm going to engage everyone I need to keep it performing well or to return it back to good performance if it slips. So the process owner is responsible for process performance at a tactical level. This already should indicate to you who should be a process owner, but I'll get to that in a moment. Tactical level. Next, they are overseeing measurement, reporting, and continuous improvement. So 3 areas of responsibility: measuring the process, reporting on it, and doing something about it when it's needing to be improved. Even if it's performing well, you want to keep getting it better and better and better. Here's the tricky part. We've been operating in a siloed, function-based environment for decades and decades and decades and decades. Processes are not functional. They are holistic. So this is one of the things that Lean brings to the table that's very powerful, but a lot of people are still resisting pretty intensely. And until we get through that resistance, this is going to be very difficult to apply Lean effectively in a non-manufacturing setting. This person, this process owner, has to have authority for those 3 areas, measurement, reporting, and continuous improvement, across all functional areas, regardless of where he or she sits on the org chart. So if they're in function A, and the process goes through A, B, C, they have authority for engaging B and C level staff and leadership in solving problems. Toyota doesn't have the kind of org charts that we have. They get stuff done. They solve problems without going, oh, I can't go there because that person, it's just not like that. And we just create our own nightmares in organizations and tie our hands because of a piece of paper that's got some lines and boxes on it. And so one of the things we have to do is make sure that we're talking first at a leadership level and get them to buy into this whole concept, and then down to a functional level and frontline level to help everyone understand what this person's authority is. So again, they don't just own the process to the point where they just create whatever they want with no input. They are obligated to involve all the parties like you would normally do. So who is this person? First of all, it is one person. It's not a shared responsibility. It's not a team responsibility. It is one person. When everyone's in charge, no one's in charge. When everyone's responsible, no one's responsible. And this person needs to be at a manager level or below. It's a tactical level issue that's being managed. So a director has too many irons in the fire and too many high-level issues to deal with to be able to keep the heat on and to be able to keep their eye on that ball. And certainly a vice president, the higher you go, the worse the candidate is to be looking at a process at this level. So typically, you've got this big cross-functional process. Typically, the process owner resides in the functional area that has the greatest, what I call, skin in the game. So they're the ones that are doing the most for that process. Now, this is probably going to shake some of you up on the phone, but this person should not be a continuous improvement dedicated professional. Should not. If you need to have someone in that role be a process owner for the first month or 2 while you're passing the baton to the area, okay, that's fine. I can live with that. But this is not, you have to teach these departments how to manage their own processes. You'll never be able to get a staff big enough in a dedicated continuous improvement department to be managing processes on behalf of people who are owning them. And to someone's question on the registration form, how do I manage people that I don't directly supervise? You can't. You can't manage people you don't directly supervise. And so you have to be able to pass the baton so that processes are being managed by people right in the direct line of fire. So that's who the person should be. Now, the director or above that's involved as an executive sponsor, they are making sure the process owner is doing his or her job, and they're checking in and making sure things are well, running well, but they're not the one analyzing data. So think of it this way. Think of a process owner being a doctor. I'm desperate for metaphors here to try to help people understand what a process owner is. And, I've been in the color world now for, I graduated in 1980, so whatever that is. I've been at it for a long time, and this is a completely foreign concept still in the white collar world, so I understand, but we can't keep doing this. We can't keep doing what we've always done because we're going to keep on being what we've always been. So I'm desperate for metaphors. Think of a process owner as a process doctor. What does a doctor do? Well, first, a doctor uses the PDCA cycle. They first diagnose the condition, and then they consider treatment options, and they figure out which one's going to possibly be the best based on the diagnosis, and so they implement that, and then they monitor. They're constantly monitoring, and it could be a nurse as well or any kind of healthcare provider, but often it's a doctor monitoring a condition. And then if the patient starts getting better or worse, there's modification. It's PDCA. So if you think about process management this way, maybe this will help get your leadership understanding and your peers understanding on what needs to be in place for a process owner. So I'm going to move on, but if you have any other questions about process ownership, please ask during the Q&A. Let's now move to post-implementation. And again, I've skipped a lot of steps, but I've hit the ones that I think are the biggest determinants of whether you can sustain an improvement or not. Let's now take a look at, now we're in our check phase, so we've implemented an improvement. We've done all the right things. So I've skipped through a lot. You've trained everyone. You've got documented standard work. You have a sustainability plan you've created, which I'll get into an example of that at the very end of today's webinar. Now the process is running. You've turned it on. Hopefully you've had a hard start to the process, a hard rollout as we call it, and not a soft rollout. So hopefully like one day it's being done this way and the next day it's being done the new way. Now it's time to monitor the performance of that process and conduct actual formal audits. I'm not a big fan in real frequent audits, but I do think that audits need to be done about every quarter to annually at the very least. Frequently. And by an audit, what I mean is you put a fake something or rather through the system and you see how it performs. So, you can put a fake order through the system. I mean, you have to kind of work based on the process. It's like a mystery shopper, if you can think of it that way, to see how the process is really performing. And if you can't, because some processes you can't do that, some IT systems won't allow you to do that. If you can't do it, then you have to get data a different way, but you have to somehow formally audit the process. So what are the things we can do now in this check phase in order to assure sustainability? This is a whole list of what you can take a look at, but notice it's process owner, process owner, process owner, process owner, process owner. This is now very much in the hands of the process owner. So you may be starting to feel like, wow, this is a lot. Yes, it is. It is a lot. Processes that aren't managed and that aren't looked at in this way do not sustain themselves. Or they sustain themselves for a while and everyone's asleep at the wheel, no one's watching it, and all of a sudden you wake up one day and you've got a fire burning out of control on your hands. The only way to prevent fires is to watch. So we're watching for hot spots and not waiting until we're in flames and can't even control the blaze. So now let's move into the act phase. We're going to have to adjust the process based on those KPIs and based on what our performance is revealing to us. So this is where you move into the continuous improvement cycle. And this is where you have the process owner now reaching out across those functional areas and lobbying for resources and getting leadership to build consensus that there's something that needs to be done here. I need help, blah, blah, blah. And this is where the cycle begins again. So once you need to make an improvement, you need to make the improvement. Now, let's take a look at it again one more time with how you get this process to stick. And these again are some of just the key issues. You have to have a clear strategy that gets you aligned between what you need to accomplish, what the operation needs to accomplish, and what the business goals are of the organization. You need to involve the right people. If the right people aren't involved, it is high risk that the process will not sustain. You need to have a robust process that you're using to create the improvement. so that you're not just process tampering, you're actually making a change that's an actual improvement, and you need to use a robust process to sustain it. And it is not going to happen unless you have consistent and focused attention on it. One of the things that I just had a meeting with someone a couple days ago, and they were really struggling on what it's going to take to sustain the process. And I said, look, why is it that we think that somehow in business processes will do things that nothing in any other walk of life does? I mean, nothing in life. If you didn't have red lights, how hard would it be for traffic to work? There is a reason why we have controls in place, and this process owner is the person that's charged with doing that. So what doesn't sustain is when the process is merely changed versus it really being improved. I mean, I think all too often employees are a bit cynical when you approach improvement because they're used to process tampering. And it's usually process tampering because someone who doesn't do the work was involved in designing this, quote, improvement, unquote. And so, in fact, I just saw an example at the grocery store last night. I needed to return something. And the guy didn't know how to do it, so he asked this coworker, and the coworker said, oh, well, they changed the process. He said, oh, really? What do we do now? And the guy goes through this whole thing, and you could tell my checker had no idea that that process had changed. There was nothing in writing, and he looked at the guy and said, well, I'm not doing that. I mean, that's just ridiculous. And so he just did it his own way, and this is what people will do. And this is not necessarily a bad news situation, because that guy was doing what it took to serve me, regardless of what the process was. So somebody that doesn't wait on people, who's not a checker, put in a whole bunch of controls that really don't make any sense when you're trying to serve a customer. And that's why you have to have the front lines involved. So it leads right into the second bullet point. If the new process makes work more difficult, after people have gotten used to it, then we have failed, and there is no way it will sustain. If it sustains, then it's going to be sustained. It will be sustained on a kind of lying basis, where people will play as though they're doing the process, but they'll be circumventing it every chance they can. When the workforce isn't fully engaged, I think I've beat this one to a dead horse right now, beat it to a pulp. So engage your front lines. And then when the process isn't being watched, it has to be monitored. I want to just share with you a quick thing about monitoring, and this is just, again, going back to Psych 101. There was a hospital in Canada that was having a lot of post-surgical infections, and they found that it might be linked to hand washing, and unfortunately, surgeon hand washing. It's a horrible thought, but it happens. So they put a camera in place over the hand washing area, and infections dropped significantly. They removed the camera, and infections went back up. They put the camera back in, infections went down. This is just to show human nature. I wish it wasn't the way it is. I'm sure everyone that's on the phone that leads improvement wishes that wasn't the way it is, but it is what it is. And so what we have to do is work with that and find ways to be successful given the nature of human beings. So in conclusion, what I'd like to talk about is the culture thing that we're all struggling with. The process that you use to make improvement, I am convinced, is going to shift your organizational culture faster than any amount of talking about culture and having training sessions and leadership getting rah-rah around culture or any even facilitator development. You shift culture through behavioral changes, and the behavioral changes come from having a different way of operating. And so that process that you use to make improvement is absolutely vital in shifting that culture, and you can become a very well oiled machine while you're also becoming an organization that really truly embraces continuous improvement in every step of the way. So as far as an actual sustainability plan, in the Kaizen Event Planner that Mike Osterling and I co-wrote, we do have a sustainability plan on the CD. But again, I think our intent in putting this together wasn't to create an actual plan, because every process, every organization, every industry is different. But rather, we put together the questions that need to be included in your sustainability plan. So it's divided into, the first part of it is all the communication and training questions questions so that you can make sure that the improvement has been properly communicated and trained. And there's all kinds of information in there about, you don't just email out standard work. You don't tell people verbally what the new process is. It needs to be documented, and people need to be trained. And it's important to learn, what good training is. And then the second part of it is the whole monitoring and measurement piece. Who's going to be the process owner, and who's going to be monitoring, and when are they going to monitor, and all those kinds of things. So that's something to take a look at if you don't have the book yet. It's a good set of questions, I think, for putting together your sustainability plan, and you do need to have one. So what we were going to accomplish in this short hour is some practical how-tos for implementing those 4 essential elements: strategy, people, and the process for making improvement, and then post-improvement or post-implementation. How to use KPIs to keep the heat on, just overview. The characteristics, roles, and responsibilities of effective process owners. How to help leadership understand what their return on investment is, and that this doesn't happen overnight. And then how the process that you use for improvement creates culture. You don't necessarily have culture creating the way that you operate with processes. So I have one more thing I want to mention about leadership. I just was looking at bullet 4 there. I think it's really important to include leaders, if you can, in one process improvement strategy or effort or activity. I think one of the things that happens is the higher up you go in an organization, the less familiar you are with what it was like at the front lines and how hard it is to make an improvement. I think, when I have leaders come into briefings, you could just see them going like, wow, this is hard work, because there's all these moving parts and all these different policies that have to shift, and then you have to get approval here and there and everywhere. It's very hard work. And it's our job as improvement professionals to help them understand how hard this is and how much time it takes. So when I talk with leaders about the time investment, I'll often say to them, well, if you want to, improve this process, it's a 3-month process to improve this one process. And I'm talking about a fairly meaty process. And oftentimes they'll look at me like, are you nuts? And I'm like, no, it's a very complicated process to change a process, because there's a lot of complexity in organizations. So you can get, smaller things done, of course, in a Kaizen event, just a 2 to 5 day activity. But if you're shifting a fairly meaty process, it does take some time. And it's helpful to start laying the groundwork so that they understand that, it didn't get broken overnight, it's not going to get fixed overnight, and none of us have magic dust. So it's a heavy lifting kind of activity. Okay, so that is it for content. Again, I know that was extremely high level, but that's what we can do in a 1-hour webinar. I'm going to now turn it over to Q&As. I see quite a few questions have come in. Please feel free to keep sending your questions. And then I also have some questions I pulled from the registration, so that we can try to address those as well. So what I'll do is I'll start with the questions that are coming in from the webinar participants now, and then I'll move to the PowerPoint slide as we get through these. All right, first question. Can an individual, him or herself, put together an X matrix for a personal plan if the management does not participate in the same? Obviously, individual and CI role will have to know the details on metrics, goals, and yearly objectives. Yes, I mean, it's more effective to do in a team setting so that you get consensus and alignment, but if you have to, it certainly beats nothing to put one together and then sell it. So if you put one together and you get the organization's goals and objectives, then you can take a look across the whole organization and figure out which improvement areas create the best opportunity for them to realize and achieve the results that they're looking for. But you do still need to sell it, because you need to have consensus in order to move forward effectively in making improvement. Really, I've long said, and my clients have lived this. If you don't have, let's say that there's a fairly big process that's cross-functional, and there are 3 leaders over the functional areas. If all 3 leaders don't agree that the process should be improved, I will not even go there. we'll take time to work on gaining consensus before we go there, because you'll never get support from the entire functional area that reports to that director. And so you have to figure out the root cause of why this one person is against it, and that's where the psychology comes in again. So you would have to get that buy-in before you would execute the X matrix. I believe that's my 2 cents on that. Okay, next question. Is the presentation audio available later for reference and use? Yes, yes, yes. So I am recording it, and it will be available, I think it's about a half hour after the webinar it's available. If you email me, I will send you a link to it. And I am going to eventually add navigation onto my website so you can get to these. Oh, and the other thing is, you should know this. I just signed up for Vimeo. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Vimeo, Vimeo. And I actually think I'm going to be putting most of my webinars on Vimeo. So if you don't get my newsletter yet, sign up for the newsletter, because I'll announce that as soon as it's available. Hopefully I'll get it done by next month's newsletter so that all the webinars will be available. The materials won't be on Vimeo, but the recorded webinar is. Okay, next question. How can one verify that staff-focused measures are directly related to improvement being made in the area? Will it not be the best guess situation with very low confidence level? Well, okay, so I'm going to guess that this person asking this question may be Six Sigma trained, because one of the things that is a little bit of a difference between Lean and Six Sigma is this whole concept of accuracy versus precision, and getting opinions, subjective opinions about how work feels, I feel, and Lean feels, is a very valid exercise, because you want to be improving the organization's bottom line, improving service to the customer, while you're also making the workplace a much better place to be. I mean, we work for a long time, so why not make it so that it's a really great place? And respect for human dignity, respect for people is the number one, or there's one of the 2 core Toyota tenets, the other one being continuous improvement. So I'm using surveys almost every time now, pre and post improvement surveys of the staff, to assess what they think about it and what they feel about it. I think it's a very valuable exercise to go through. Okay, if you referred to a book for the sustainability plan, could you please repeat the detail and show the slide for sample sustainability plan, please? Yes, I will. So the book is the Kaizen Event Planner that Mike Osterling and I co-wrote. It's available on Amazon, or it was published by Productivity Press, which is now called CRC Press. You can buy it through them. You can buy it through barnesandnoble.com. It has a CD in the back of it with an Excel file that has 15 worksheets in it, with tools like this to plan, execute, and do follow-up for Kaizen events. The book is very specific to Kaizen events, but any kind of improvement activity, even just traditional projects, could benefit from the things that we do in a Kaizen event. It's just more critical in a Kaizen event because you don't have much time to get results. So I hope that helps. Okay, next question. When selecting KPIs to measure improvements, what relationship do they have with X matrix targets to improve? Is a bowling chart a good way to monitor how individual improvements contribute to overall objectives? Ooh, I have to admit, Paul, I don't know what a bowling chart is. I would love to see that, though. It sounds intriguing. A bowling chart. No, I don't know what that is. So when selecting KPIs to measure improvements, what relationship do they have with the X matrix targets? Well, so let me back up. The X matrix, often, if it's well done, there will often be levels of it. So you'll have a high-level X matrix with the big goals and the big improvement objectives, and then it'll trickle down. So you can have, a division X matrix Hoshin plan, and then you can have a department Hoshin plan. And so the objectives get more and more specific as you go down toward the front lines. So what relationship they have is they should tie directly. I don't know, maybe I'm not understanding that question. So if you could just maybe elaborate a little bit more on your question if I didn't answer that, Paul, please, that would be helpful. Okay, do you think there's a need to have an overall E2E process owner, enterprise to enterprise, I assume you mean, at the strategic level? How would this person relate to the VSM champion? Ooh, that is a good question. So value stream mapping champions, for those of you who aren't in manufacturing, there are value stream managers and value stream champions. Value stream managers are typically people within manufacturing that have profit and loss responsibility for a product line. So they often will have all the responsibility from product development, sometimes not, but sometimes product development all the way through to delivery to the customer and everything in between. And sometimes it's just more at the beginning of manufacturing through to delivery to the customer. And so they are very cross-functional leaders in manufacturing. This is a whole new concept to non-manufacturing. So an E2E process owner at the strategic level for a service line, I could see some value, but I wouldn't call them a process owner because it would be strategic, and to me process ownership is quite tactical. So it would be kind of similar to a value stream manager in manufacturing that you're referring to. I would call them something else. I mean, you could call them a value stream manager, if it's based on a service line or something like that. But I think if you start with process owners, that's going to be a big enough cage to rattle in most organizations. Start with that. I think you'll gain a lot. And yes, it's always great to have a cross-functional leader that sees and can authorize work across the whole value stream. Okay, what role do WIP caps, i.e. pull systems and limits on number of items in the process, play in sustainment? Any good example in office settings of this? Okay, so work in process caps, pull systems and limits on number of items in the process, play in sustainment. Well, again, WIP caps need to be managed just like everything else, because if you say that there's only a maximum of 8 whatevers that can form in queue before you have a signal that allows people to redeploy resources and all that, and people don't stick to it, then it doesn't really work. So you would definitely need someone managing to make sure that those WIP caps are being adhered to. Let's see, so if you're talking about Kanban, well, I guess you're talking about any kind of pull system. So maybe it's the maximum number of reports that could be requested of a department at any given time, or the maximum number of orders that are in a certain phase at any given time, that type of thing. I do think that it helps if you have those in place, because it helps maintain stability in the process, but they have to be adhered to. And in non-manufacturing, one of the biggest challenges is that people put pull systems in place, and then even if the pull system starts failing, in other words, if the queues get built up and there's the need to reject work, then sometimes I see no one willing to do the heavy lifting to reallocate resources so that you can get flow going again. So it's a tricky thing in the office environment, but yeah, I believe it would help a lot to sustain the process. I don't know if I answered you, Kelly, but give me another follow-up question if you want a little more detail on that. Okay, so now I'm going to go back over to the PowerPoint slide while the rest of you are asking more questions. I'm actually going to put all the hands down. There's still some stragglers from before. And then from now on, if you want to ask a question verbally, go ahead and raise your hand, please, and I'll call on you. I'll unmute you, and then we can talk voice to voice. All right, so I'm going back now to the questions. Oops, that's not the questions. There we go. Okay, so one issue that someone wanted me to discuss is how to hold other departments accountable and motivate individuals to sustain improvement when I'm not their supervisor. So I addressed the first one, their second part of that already, that you really can't when you're not their supervisor. I mean, you can be an influence leader, and you can influence by example and certainly by having good process controls in place. But as far as holding other departments accountable, this one intrigues me. These were two different people that wrote this, because if the leadership within the other departments has been adequately involved and engaged in the improvement process, they should have already bought into the KPIs. They should have been actually part of deciding what the key performance indicators would be. So now, if they bought into it and now they're suddenly not wanting to do anything about it, then that would be a leadership issue. And I would escalate it. After I had some conversations and was unsuccessful in making any kind of headway, then I would escalate it. But I think that may be what has been happening in this particular case, is that perhaps other departments aren't adequately involved in the improvement process. Again, back to Psych 101, I'll say it till I'm blue in the face. If they're not engaged in it and don't agree with everything along the way, then it's likely that they're going to rear up and not do what they're supposed to be doing. So whoever asked that in the registration, if you want to ask any follow-up questions, that would be great. All right, another one was how to overcome resistance to change in a political environment. Well, it's interesting because I think all non-manufacturing environments, actually I think manufacturing is very political too, but I think it gets harder the more highly regulated the organization is, and the more siloed it is, and the more layers of leadership there are, which there are tons outside of manufacturing, the more political it will be just by nature. So resistance to change is kind of everywhere. Resistance to change, I always go back to why. We use root cause analysis with process. We have to use it with people as well. Why are they resisting? Is it fear? Is it lack of understanding? Is it, what is it that's causing this person to resist? If you have, going back to everything we talked about already, if you have extremely clear drivers for the need for improvement, and the improvement's clearly tied to the organizational's overarching goals for the year, and if everyone that needs to have a voice has a voice on the team that's going to be making the improvement, and if you've got a clear executive sponsor, and if if you get all those things in place, it's laying the foundation to not experience nearly as much resistance to change. The other thing that, going back to this whole idea that we as improvement professionals have a role and an obligation in kind of shaping how leadership behaves. So in other words, it's not, or we can't do anything like just tell people what to do, but you can, as an improvement professional, say, until we get everyone to agree to this, we really can't move forward. And then kind of put the ball back in leadership's court for them to get together and agree. And if they need a facilitator for that discussion, then maybe you can serve in that role. But if it's resistance at the front lines, of course, if you have a team of 50 people that are all being asked to do something different, you can lay as great a foundation as possible, and there still might be one that would rear its head and say, I don't want to do this. So if it's the front lines, it's a little easier to deal with than if it's in leadership. Basically, they have to do it. I mean, that's the new way the organization is being measured. But if you have more than a very small number resisting, you need to take a second look at why. Leadership engagement in long-term improvement. This one I wasn't quite sure. That's exactly how it was written. I wasn't quite sure what the question is. I don't know whether it's asking how do you get leadership more deeply engaged in making improvement or not. But here's some insight into how leadership may think. I had a call yesterday from someone that said, we're kind of curious about this lean thing, and we're just starting to explore, and we don't really know what we need help with, so we don't know where to start. And I thought that was very interesting. This was a vice president that said this. And I said, okay, well, how are you performing? And I went back to quality, cost, delivery, safety, and morale. How are your customers feeling about your services? How are your employees? What's your turnover? What are your costs like? Are your expenses in line? What's your margin? What's your margin compared to your competitors? What's your market share? What's your safety record? How many workers' comp claims do you have? I mean, just ask basic questions like that to figure out how they're performing in all of those 5 areas. And then through that conversation, like, oh, okay, yeah. We definitely want to improve here. We want to improve there. So again, our job is to educate and help leaders understand the full realm of the possibilities, and then create a very clear strategy and prioritization based on that. So if that was not what this person was asking, if they could please ask a question to clarify. Okay, I have a question. Ashok, I think I'm saying this correct. You're asking me to unmute the audience. I I don't hear anybody. I can unmute you if you want to ask a question. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute you because I think that's what you're asking. So I'm going to click here. Ashok?
Yes.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing fine. I think the presentation was very well put together and gave me clear understanding about what I was thinking in my mind. It just kind of reinforced the whole thing. The one question that I would like to ask is, when you are in an organization, you said you need to be perceived as a value add, and the management is not thinking the same. How would you create a game plan so that you can basically be the star of the company?
Okay. Can I ask you a couple of questions about your particular role?
Sure.
Who do you report to? What level in the organization?
Manager.
So you report to a manager?
And I am a manager too.
And you're a manager, okay. And are you dedicated 100% to continuous improvement?
Yes.
Okay. So is there any kind of a set of goals or objectives that you've been given that you need to work on this fiscal year?
Loosely, not specifically.
Okay. So what you might want to consider is sitting down with your manager and possibly one more person, because a manager, there's still several layers above you. Sit down with them and and you take charge. You ask for the meeting and you say that I'd like to put together a game plan for the year, and I'd like to have some objectives that we decide are going to be the key determinants of my success and our success as an organization and making improvement. And then start, sometimes it's a matter of heightening the awareness that there needs to be a plan put in place, and then working through a plan. And ideally, that plan would bubble all the way up to the top, and then the leadership all along could give input into, I think we should work on this, we should work on that. Is there more than just you, or are you the only person dedicated to improvement?
There are a few more, but not reporting the same person.
Okay, so you have a decentralized improvement, it sounds like, improvement team.
Yes.
What you might want to do is see if the organization has an appetite for all of you in these different areas to get together and come up with a plan for the organization, and then divvy up the work, for the organization, so that each one of the areas you're in gets some improvement, and you work together that way. I would at least start with a conversation with your direct supervisor and say, hey, what do you think about us putting a plan together and some key measurements so we can say at the end of the year, how did I succeed? And then the other thing that I would recommend is that every time you do an improvement, you need to quantify it. If you can quantify it financially, great. Some improvements cannot be and should not be quantified financially, but at least quantify it and be able to prove and hopefully, help get that all the way up to the top of the organization, that information, so that you're proving your worth to everybody all the way up.
Okay.
Does that help?
I think, yeah, it does. I have the same thoughts. I've been in this type of role for more than a decade. So I would like to have, if you can provide email address on your slide, I would like to have one-on-one conversation on something.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Let me see if I think I put it on the very last slide. Yeah, here it is. It's on the very last slide. Oops, I didn't want to do that. Hang on. No, I don't want to end the show. There we go. So there's my email address there, ksm@ksmartin.com.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and mute you again, but please raise your hand again if you have another question. I like it when people ask verbal questions. Thank you very much. Okay, so now, somebody else want to ask a question? That was fun. Okay, I'm going back now to the questions that are being put into the GoToWebinar right now. Okay, in my previous question, oh good, this is Paul with the X Matrix. In my previous question, I was really asking if there needs to be a one-to-one direct relation between X Matrix targets to improve and KPI measures of individual improvement events. Okay, so let me back up. The KPIs are of the process that has been improved. So the targets to improve for the improvement process may or may not be exactly the same as the KPIs. Often they are exactly the same, but it really depends on what you're trying. For example, let's just say that you're trying to improve the lead time through an entire process that involves many, 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 many departments. That could be on the X matrix at a division level, and then at a KPI level, one of those or two of those departments may have a turnaround time metric that feeds into that lead time reduction, which feeds into the overarching organizational goal of being more responsive. So it depends on at what point in the organization the goal is established on whether the KPI will be exactly that or if it will be a subset of that. So think about it as umbrellas, the big umbrella goal and then the next umbrella goal and then the next umbrella goal. That might be a way to think about it. And then you said, let's see, I know they should be related, but should the focus be on individual improvement event or the overall plan? Again, the focus for KPIs isn't the event, it's the process as it's running day to day that you're measuring. I don't know if I'm being clear on that. So I hope I am. Oh, okay. So a bowling chart is a standard Hoshin-Conry tool. I've never heard it referred to as that. A bowling chart is used to measure overall X matrix plan progress on a month-to-month basis throughout the year. It is used to identify gaps between plan and actual for the overall X matrix plan. I don't know. That term is foreign to me. I don't know whether that's maybe one consultant's term that they used and made up this chart. I haven't heard about it in Toyota circles, but maybe it's something I've just completely missed. Okay, and you gave an example of one. All right, well, I'll take a look at that later. Okay, so the slides, someone is saying that they're unable to access the slides from the link. You should. Well, I don't know whether there's been any other problems or not. Okay, hang on. Sammy, I see you have your hand up. I'm going to lower it for 1 second, and then I'm going to lower everyone's hands. Could you raise your hands if you were able to successfully download the materials, please? Okay, good. All right, so I don't know why, Pablo, you may be having problems. So just send me an email and I'll send you the link again. I guess that's the best way to try this. Okay, I'm going to put the hands down again. And Sammy, I'm assuming that you want to be unmuted, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Oh, wait a minute, hang on a second. Oh, you don't have your audio pin. Okay, I sent you an audio pin. In order to unmute you, you have to enter that audio pin. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. If you could just put your audio pin in and then raise your hand again if you want me to unmute you to ask a question. Okay? All right. Can you provide the link again? Ashok. Which link, Ashok? I'm not sure which one you're talking about. The link for the slides. Okay, let me actually go all the way back to the beginning on the presentation. Hang on 1 second. Let me go back to the beginning. And then you can all see the link. I guess that's good. Okay, and then back to the slideshow. Okay, there we go. So there's the link to the handouts that have 2 slides per page or the slides, full slide per page. Okay, so now I guess, okay, I'm sorry, I need to change the slide now. So hopefully you got this. It's my website /files/webinar materials /today's date _handout or _slides, and then both of them are .pdf. All right, I'm going to go back to the questions now. So hang on. I'm sorry, all this maneuvering around here. Okay, questions. Back to slideshow. Okay, so here was an interesting one. Someone asked how to not only ensure that the improvements are sustainable but effective. And I was just really intrigued with this because, wow, you know, it almost indicates that there's a risk of process tampering going on in this organization where perhaps the changes are not necessarily improvements or just changes for change's sake. Because that's what when I hear effective, I think about the quality of the result. So hopefully, now that we've gone through some of the details of making a process sustainable, then you are coming up with actually effective, you have a very clear and deep understanding of the current state. You've done a very thorough root cause analysis. You've considered, all the possible countermeasures that might solve the problem. You've selected some based on whatever set of criteria that's appropriate. You've implemented them well. You've had the right people involved. You have measurable objectives in place. You're measuring, all those things that it takes for sustainability. So whoever asked that, if you want to elaborate, that would be great. Okay, the next question or comment was how to keep the momentum going after a Kaizen event. In the Kaizen event planner, we have a 30-day list and a parking lot list that are two different lists that need to be managed. So typically, the facilitator for the Kaizen event is managing that 30-day list, and that 30-day period is the period of time where the baton gets passed from the team, the Kaizen team, doing everything with the improvement, to the people who are managing that process, managing it. So there's this transition. I prefer to meet weekly with the team if I'm facilitating it, and we work through the 30-day list, and then the baton is passed. But part of that baton passing on that sustainability plan, you'll notice, was identifying a process owner. And so that's the thing I find that isn't being done consistently in Kaizen events, is getting that process owner identified, because organizations are still tripped up on org charts and this, no one has time and this and that. And I really have a very harsh answer to this, we've got no time. And I say, well then, you just wasted 5 days. or you have a high risk of having wasted 5 days. So, and a lot of people's time. So if you don't want to put a process owner in place with those clear responsibilities and the time to do the measurement and keeping the eye on the ball, I have no magic dust for people. So that's my 2 cents. Okay, this was also intriguing. Countermeasures to over lean thinking. I am intrigued with this. So let's see. Okay, Ram, you are still on the line. This was yours, I believe. I'm trying to figure out if you meant that people are getting rid of too many things, like they're being too waste reduction oriented, or if they're thinking that lean means get rid of people. I'm curious to know what you mean by over lean thinking. So if you're open to it, and if I see you're still on, but you may be engaged with something else, raise your hand and I'll unmute you, or you can type in a question to help me understand what you were asking. I was intrigued with that. Okay, the next one was, how do we teach sustainability? Many organizations fail to recognize it as part of the improvement process. Yes, they do, don't they? I don't know that we can teach sustainability. I think we can teach the PDCA cycle, and of course the A, and the C and the A are that sustainability piece. But I think it really comes from doing. I think you can talk all you want. It's doing and shaping behavior through doing that really matters. And so if you put this plan in place and you have a process owner and you've done all the right things to lay the foundation up front with the right people and all that stuff, I think that organizations will learn that, oh, okay, for the last 5 decades, we haven't been doing this, and this is what we've had happen. And now, with this new process, look at the results. And that will help the organizations start recognizing it and valuing it as a necessary part of process improvement. Process management is not something that it's intuitive to me, and it's probably intuitive to most of you on the line, but it is not intuitive to the lion's share of people in organizations. I just am always amazed and have to kind of step back and remember, I've been at this for over 20-some years. I get processes. I had to stop recently twice and explain what a process is. And I was having a very difficult time having them understand what is a process, and so I went back to my old standby of getting ready for work in the morning, planning a dinner party, or brushing your teeth. There's a process. Everything's a process, and so we really do. Our role as educators cannot be underestimated. It's really a big part of what we do. Okay, next question. Do you use 30-day lists, or do you try to implement the majority of the changes suggested within the 2 to 5 day period? I find 30-day lists become parking lots, and I feel the scope can be better defined to get away from the 30-day list. Yes, yes, yes. Good point, Jennifer. So yes, the one of the roles of the facilitator, I think we say this in the book, is to keep that 30-day list as short as possible. So you do that by really great scoping up front and keeping the focus, pretty narrow so that you can accomplish the full implementation within the Kaizen event. And you do it as a facilitator during the event, not allowing scope creep and keeping people's feet to the fire and making sure that they're doing as much, using the time as wisely as they can during that Kaizen event. The 30-day lists, usually when I get done with one, they can be long, but they're usually very easy things. Like it might be a matter of we ordered signage and it hasn't come in yet and that has to be hung. And we wrote a script for a telephone system to be changed, but we didn't quite get it done, and it's going to be done the next morning. Whereas things like that, most of them are pretty quick, and so the 30-day lists don't tend to go on, but I mean, I certainly have lived through a couple of Kaizen events where it went on far longer than it should. So yes, you're spot on what the role of that 30-day list is. Okay, I think that is it, and I think we're out of time. So could you please raise your hand if anyone else has any questions that they want to ask and you're in the middle of writing a question? I'll hold on for a second. Just raise your hand, please, and if not, then... oh, okay, so someone is still writing a question. Okay, let me just hang on for a second. And I don't know what to say. Okay, I guess one thing I will say is for those of you that are used to these webinars, I am so sorry, but I'm also very happy to announce that I won't be having them for the next 3 months because of a couple of large client projects. So just keep an eye on my newsletter or on my website. When I start seeing some light at the end of the tunnel, I'll start scheduling some more. And if you would be so kind, I would love to hear some ideas from you on which topics you'd like to have handled this year. That would be really helpful. So, I'll miss you all, but I have some fun stuff coming up here. Okay, here's the question. We are having difficulty in getting an event completed during the 2 to 5 days. We're spread out through 3 states, and rollout with education is very difficult. I know. So here's the thing. If the only thing you're not getting done during the 2 to 5 days is the education piece, and if everything else is good to go, then I would argue that with your geographic spread that you've still been quite successful. If you're still doing a lot of stuff after the 2 to 5 days, it's probably a scoping issue. You probably tried to take on a little too much and need to narrow your scope even further. So, and actually, let me talk about education for a second, too. In a Kaizen event, the types of improvements you make in a Kaizen event shouldn't require more than 30 minutes, maybe 45 minutes max, and it can be done in very non-traditional ways. So instead of throwing people in a conference room for, a day or two or an hour or two, you can do stand-up training at the actual sites. You can use a train-the-trainer model, where people from different locations are trained as trainers, and you have extremely standard training material and standard talking points and standard everything. You can also use some old school technology that gets forgotten these days. Like, for example, most phone systems have about a 3-minute voicemail on them. And so you can get a fair amount of information, and people are not using the phones as much as they used to, so it's kind of a welcome relief to actually have a phone call, so you can use that as an add-on to get you by during an event, for example. There's this whole idea of webinars, where you can offer a webinar on the last day of the event, like I am, and go through training that way. Obviously, training is much more effective when they're actually doing the process, but in non-manufacturing, we find that you often can't do the process because you might be changing an estimating process that happens, once every month, and there just doesn't happen to be an estimate in there to be done, or you might be doing something that there's just no physical way to to get it done during the Kaizen event because of systems limitations or things like that. So it's a little trickier when you get off the shop floor into the office knowledge work and service environment, but I think my gut tells me it's probably a scoping issue, Susan. And if you want to give me any specific examples and you want to send me an email, feel free, and I can maybe give you a little more specific advice on that. All right, I think that's a wrap. So thank you very, very much. I hope you all have a great year and a great quarter. It's not going to be all years till I see y'all, but have a great quarter, and please drop me an email if you have any quick questions. Even when I'm on the road, I'm never without my BlackBerry. So have a great year and a good start to your year, and lean on. See you later. Thanks. Bye-bye.